The morning Rosa Ralston lost everything she had left in the world, the sun had the audacity to shine with the kind of brilliant gold that made Dust Creek, Texas look almost beautiful. She had arrived at the land office at 7 in the morning, before the heat became cruel, before the flies gathered at the horse troughs, before the saloon across the street started its daily commerce of whiskey and regret. She had her papers folded in the inside pocket of her gray dress, papers she had guarded more carefully than she had guarded anything in her 24 years on this earth, including her own heart. She had walked the 11 miles from her homestead because her horse had gone lame 2 weeks prior, and she had not had the money to have the farrier look at him properly, only enough to keep the animal comfortable in his small corral, while she tried to work out what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was devastation dressed up in legal language. The land agent, a man named Pruitt with a face like old leather, and eyes that never quite looked at you straight, had taken her papers, studied them for what felt like a full century, and then told her in the flat, indifferent tone of a man who delivered bad news the way other men delivered newspapers, that the claim was no longer valid. That her late husband's original filing, made in the spring of 1882, had contained an error in the survey description. That a neighboring rancher by the name of Harlan Voss had filed a competing claim 3 months ago citing that error, and that the territorial office in Austin had reviewed the matter and sided with Voss. Rosa had stood very still while Pruitt explained this. She had stood still the way a person stands still when the ground beneath their feet has just dropped away, and they are trying to determine if they are still standing or already falling. She had asked 3 questions in a very careful voice. She had listened to 3 answers that did not help her at all. And then she had thanked the man, which seemed absurd even as she was doing it, because what exactly was she thanking him for? And she had walked out through the front door of the Dust Creek land office and sat down on the top step and put her face in her hands and wept. She was still weeping when the boots appeared. They were worn boots, the leather darkened by years and weather, with the particular scuff marks that came from a man who worked hard and did not think much about appearances. They settled on the step beside her with a creak of leather and the soft sound of a man making himself comfortable in an uncomfortable place, and then there was a long, patient silence that was, Rosa would later think, one of the kindest things anyone had offered her in months. "Tell me everything," the voice said. It was a low voice, unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had learned that words worked better when you did not rush them. Rosa lifted her face from her hands and looked sideways and found herself looking at a man of about 29 or 30, lean and sun-darkened, with a jaw that needed a shave and dark eyes that were watching her with an expression that was not pity and was not curiosity, but was something more careful than either. He wore a plain blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a battered brown hat that he had removed and was holding in both hands, turning the brim slowly in a habit that looked unconscious. "You do not know me," Rosa said. Her voice was raw. "No," he agreed. "But you look like a person who needs somebody to listen, and I have got nowhere pressing to be." He paused. "Name is Elias Keller. I ride for the Caldwell outfit up past the ridge, and I promise you I am not the kind of man who asks out of nosiness." Rosa looked at him for a moment longer. She had spent the past 8 months learning, through hard experience, that most people's interest in her troubles was either useless sympathy or the prelude to some offer she did not want. But something about the way this man sat, entirely without urgency, as though he had simply decided that this step was where he belonged right now, made her say the words she had been holding tightly inside herself all morning. "They took my land," she said. "My husband filed the claim 3 years ago. He died last winter. Fever. I have been working that land alone since January, and I thought it was mine. I had his papers, and I had been paying the fees, and I had planted a kitchen garden, and I have 30 acres of winter wheat coming in, and they just told me in there that it does not matter because some cattleman named Harlan Voss has filed a claim on it, and Austin has agreed with him, and I have until the end of the month to vacate." She stopped. The words had come out faster than she had intended, and her voice had cracked twice in the telling, and she was furious with herself for that. But Elias Keller just nodded slowly, his dark eyes steady on her face. "You have got until the end of the month," he repeated. "That is 3 weeks. 17 days," she corrected. He turned the hat brim once more in his hands. "And the wheat, standing in the field, I put everything I had into that planting. The seed, the labor, everything." She wiped her face with the back of her hand in a gesture that was entirely without elegance and entirely honest. "If I lose the land, I lose the crop. If I lose the crop, I have nothing. No money, no home. My nearest kin is a cousin in Missouri who can barely feed her own family." Elias was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man trying to think of something comforting to say, but the quiet of a man actually thinking. "This Harlan Voss," he said, "big man, red-faced, runs the W Ranch southeast of town." Rosa blinked. "I believe so. You know him." "I know of him," Elias said carefully, which Rosa would later learn was the way he expressed a low opinion of a person without being unkind about it. "He has been trying to expand his range for 3 years. He has done this kind of thing before, finding technical errors in homesteader filings. He has a lawyer in Austin." "And I have nothing," Rosa said flatly. "You have 17 days," Elias said, and the way he said it made it sound less like a sentence and more like the beginning of a plan. Rosa looked at him, really looked at him, the way you look at something when you are trying to determine if it is real. He looked back at her without flinching, without the slightly too eager expression of a man who wanted something from her, without the careful blankness of a man who was trying to seem helpful while meaning nothing by it. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked. It was a blunt question, but she had learned bluntness this past year. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said simply, and then he stood and put his hat back on his head and offered her his hand. "Let me buy you a cup of coffee at the diner across the way, and you can tell me the rest of it, and we will see what there is to be done." Rosa Ralston had learned, in the year since her husband Thomas's death, that grief and hardship had a way of burning away everything except what was essential. She had learned she was stronger than she had believed, and more alone than she had feared. And she had learned that the frontier was magnificent and merciless in equal measure. She had not learned, and had not expected, that sitting on those cracked wooden steps weeping into her hands was going to lead anywhere except the long walk home to a problem she could not solve. She took his hand. It was a working man's hand, calloused and warm, and he helped her to her feet with a straightforward practicality that managed to be neither dismissive nor overly solicitous. And she thought, standing on the boardwalk in the bright May morning of 1885 in Dust Creek, Texas, that whatever happened next, at least there was coffee. The diner was run by a woman named Edna Marsh, who was 60 years old and had opinions about everything, and kept them mostly to herself, except when she decided not to. And she poured their coffee without being asked, and gave Elias a look that said she approved of him for reasons she was not going to explain, and left them alone at the corner table by the window. Rosa told Elias everything, as he had asked. Not just the land office disaster, but all of it, because once she had started she found she could not stop, and he did not try to stop her. She told him about Thomas, who had been a good man and a hard worker but not a lucky one, who had come to Texas from Ohio with dreams that the land had taken seriously for exactly 2 years, before breaking his body with a winter fever so severe that by the time she had ridden for the doctor it had been too late. She told him about the 8 months of working the homestead alone, the blisters and the long days and the nights when the coyotes howled, and the cabin felt like a box someone had buried her in. She told him about the wheat, which she said with a kind of fierce, quiet pride that Elias noticed and filed away carefully, because it told him something important about who this woman was. "I planted it myself," she said. "Every row. I could not afford to hire help, so I did it alone. 30 acres. People in town thought I was foolish. A woman alone, they said, as though the wheat would not grow because my hands were the wrong kind. "It is growing," Elias said. "It is growing," she agreed. "And in 6 weeks it would have been ready to harvest, and I would have had enough to pay off the seed debt and perhaps buy a proper plow, and I had a plan. I had a real plan for the first time in a year." Elias wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. "Tell me about the survey error. What exactly did Pruitt say was wrong?" Rosa pulled the papers from her inside pocket and spread them on the table, smoothing them with hands that had steadied now that she had something practical to focus on. He leaned forward and studied them, and she watched his face while he read, which was a face that gave away a careful amount. He had a small scar along his jawline, probably from a fence wire or a fall, and his dark hair had the kind of curl to it that the heat made worse, and his eyes, when they moved across the page, moved with the methodical attention of a man who was not going to miss anything. "Here," he said, pointing, "the meets and bounds description. It says the northeastern boundary starts from a cedar post at the creek fork, but the actual post, when Voss's surveyor went out there, was not at the fork but 100 yards east of it. Thomas planted that post himself," Rosa said, her voice tight. "I believe you," Elias said, "and I think the post moved. Creek flooding can do that, or someone can do that." He looked up from the papers and his eyes met hers. "I am not saying Voss moved it, but I am saying it is a possibility worth considering." Rosa stared at him. The thought had occurred to her in the dark hours of last night when she had lain awake trying to understand how this had happened, but she had pushed it aside because it felt too monstrous. She had not wanted to believe that a man could be so deliberately cruel as to engineer the theft of a widow's land. "If someone moved that post," she said slowly, "how would we prove it?" "We might not be able to," Elias said honestly. "But there is another way to approach this. Your husband's original survey, when was it conducted and by whom?" "A man named Alcott, from Junction City." "I know Alcott. He is a thorough man. He would have field notes." Elias sat back and picked up his coffee. "Those notes would show exactly where he placed that post on the day of the survey. If we can get those notes, and if we can demonstrate that the post's current position does not match Alcott's original description, that is grounds to challenge the territorial office's decision." Rosa felt something happen in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. It was a small thing, fragile as a candle flame in a drafty room, but it was hope, and after 8 months of operating without it, she had forgotten how it felt. "How do you know all of this?" she asked. Elias smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that moved all the way to his eyes and changed them. "My father was a land agent in Kansas before we came south. I grew up hearing about survey disputes the way other children hear about fairy stories. I did not plan to use that knowledge, but here we are." "Here we are," Rosa agreed softly. They sat in Edna Marsh's diner for 2 hours, and by the time they left, Rosa had a plan written on the back of one of her papers in Elias Keller's precise, slightly cramped handwriting. It was a plan that involved a 60-mile round trip to Junction City to find Surveyor Alcott and his field notes, a visit to Dusk Creek's only attorney, a man named Beaumont who was rumored to be capable when he was sober, and a formal written appeal to the Territorial Land Office in Austin challenging the decision on the grounds of conflicting survey evidence. It was, Elias acknowledged, a long chance. "But it is a chance," Rosa said. "It is a chance," he confirmed. He rode her back to her homestead that afternoon on his horse, a steady roan gelding named Copper, with Rosa sitting behind him and her hands resting carefully on her own knees rather than holding onto him, maintaining a decorum that amused Elias slightly because the horse's gait was not particularly smooth, and her careful posture cost her some obvious effort. The 11 miles passed with conversation about practical things, about the appeal process, about what to expect from Beaumont the attorney, and then gradually the conversation drifted into other territory, the way conversations do when two people find that they are unexpectedly comfortable with each other. He asked about Ohio, and she told him about the farm she had grown up on, about her father who had been a Methodist minister and her mother who had been quietly more practical than anyone gave her credit for, about the way the Ohio River looked in autumn. She asked about him, and he told her about growing up in Kansas during the cattle drive years, about coming to Texas as a young man of 19 with $40 and an ambition that outpaced his resources, about the years of working cattle that had eventually brought him to the Caldwell outfit outside Dust Creek, which was honest work and decent pay, and a bunkhouse that was drafty in winter, but at least stayed upright. "You have never wanted your own land?" she asked. There was a brief pause before he answered. "I want it," he said. "I am saving for it, another couple of years." She nodded and looked out at the rolling grassland that the late afternoon light was turning amber and copper, and thought about the 30 acres of wheat she might lose, and felt the familiar weight of that settle back onto her shoulders. But it was lighter than it had been this morning. It was lighter because she was no longer carrying it alone. When they reached the homestead, she slid off Copper and stood in the yard and looked at the small cabin and the barn and the corral where her lame horse, whose name was Biscuit on account of his color, stood watching them with mild interest. And then she turned and looked at the wheat field and felt her jaw set with a determination that Elias, watching her from the saddle, found somewhere between admirable and heartbreaking. "It is a good field," he said quietly. "It is a good field," she said. "And I am going to keep it." He touched the brim of his hat. "I will come back tomorrow morning early. We can ride to Junction City and find Alcott." She looked up at him. "Mr. Keller, I cannot ask you to do all of this." "You did not ask," he pointed out. "I offered." He looked at her steadily. "And if it would set your mind at ease, you can think of it as a man helping a neighbor, which is what people are supposed to do on this frontier, though I will grant you they do not always manage it." Rosa looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Will you stay for supper? It is not much, but I have salt pork and cornbread and the first of the spring onions." He stayed. They ate at the small table inside the cabin, in the light of the oil lamp, and the conversation moved easily between them the way it had on the ride out, finding its own rhythm. She showed him Thomas's survey map, the original one, spread out on the table between their plates, and he pointed out details she had not known to look for, and she told him things about the property that he would not have known from a map alone: the way the creek ran high in spring and low in August, the stand of post oaks on the eastern edge that she used for firewood, the rocky outcrop in the northern corner that was useless for planting, but where she liked to sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down. "You love this place," he said. "It was not a question." "I did not think I would," she admitted. "When Thomas first brought me here, I thought, this is the hardest place I have ever seen. The sky is too big and the wind is too constant and everything is trying to survive, including the people." She looked at the window, though it was dark now and there was nothing to see outside but the dark. "But it got into me somehow. I do not know when. One morning I woke up and it was home." Elias looked at her across the table with an expression she could not entirely read, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "I know that feeling." He rode back to the Caldwell ranch after supper in the dark, and Rosa washed the plates and banked the fire and lay in the narrow bed that had once been too large for her alone, and stared at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in a very long time, as though tomorrow might be something other than another version of today's difficulty. She did not let herself think too much about Elias Keller specifically. She was a sensible woman, and she had enough to manage without adding the complications of feeling anything about a man she had met on the steps of the land office 6 hours ago. But she did allow herself to notice that the cabin felt less quiet than it usually did, as though his presence had left something behind when he went, some warmth in the air that the lamp alone could not account for. He came back the next morning at 6 o'clock, early enough that the dew was still on the grass, and the sky was the particular pale gold of very early morning. He brought a bundle of biscuits wrapped in cloth from the Caldwell cook, a man named Dooley who apparently took it as a personal insult if anyone in his vicinity went hungry, and a thermos of coffee that was already warm when he arrived, which meant he had ridden fast. "How far is Junction City?" Rosa asked, tying her hair back and putting on her hat. 28 miles, he said. "We can make it there and back in a day if we do not linger." She had arranged for a neighbor woman, a Swedish widow named Mrs. Lindqvist who lived 3 miles west, to look in on Biscuit during the day, and she settled on 2 coppers back behind Elias, and they set out in the early morning light with the biscuits eaten and the coffee finished, and the day stretching ahead of them like a road that might lead somewhere good. The ride to Junction City was long and beautiful and punctuated by conversation that moved from the practical to the personal and back again. Rosa learned that Elias had a sister named Clara in San Antonio who was married to a school teacher, that he had read considerably more than his occupation might suggest, that he had an opinion about the quality of the territorial government that was pointed and not entirely incorrect, and that when something amused him, he had a way of pressing his lips together very briefly before the smile got out, as though he was giving himself one last chance to contain it before giving in. Elias learned that Rosa had taught herself to shoot after Thomas died because she had decided that being alone on a homestead was a practical argument for being armed, that she had strong views on the unfair treatment of homesteaders by the large cattle interests in the region, that she made exceptionally good cornbread, and that she had a directness in conversation that he found both refreshing and slightly unnerving in the best possible way. They found Surveyor Alcott in his office in Junction City, a small man with enormous side whiskers and the obsessive organizational habits of a man who had never lost a document in his life. He remembered the Ralston survey. He remembered it with the specificity of a man who took professional pride in his work, and was accordingly offended by the suggestion that it had been found wanting. "The Cedar Post," he said, pulling out a leather-bound field book and opening it to the relevant entry without hesitation, "was placed by me personally at the confluence of the north and east branches of Caldwell Creek, at a distance of exactly 42 feet from the nearest standing timber, which was a post oak of approximately 14 inches diameter." He stabbed the entry with a finger. "It is all here, dated, witnessed, and precisely noted. If that post is now somewhere other than where I put it, then that post was moved after I put it." Rosa felt the breath go out of her slowly. "Would you be willing to write an affidavit to that effect?" Alcott looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who had been waiting to be asked exactly this. "Young lady, I would be delighted. Nothing raises my temperature faster than an attack on my professional record." He wrote the affidavit on the spot, in a precise and beautifully organized hand, and had it witnessed by his assistant, and gave Rosa the original along with a certified copy of the field book entry. Rosa held the affidavit with both hands and felt the candle flame of hope burn a little higher and a little steadier. On the ride back, she sat behind Elias and let herself rest against his back for a little while, because it had been a long day and the road was uneven and she was tired, and she told herself this was purely practical and not anything else, and she almost believed it. "This is good," Elias said, not referring to her leaning against him but to the affidavit, though his voice had something softer in it than it strictly needed to have for a purely professional observation. "This is genuinely useful. Combined with what Beaumont can do with the appeal process, this could work." "Tell me honestly," Rosa said, "what are the odds?" He thought about it properly rather than giving her the kind of false reassurance she did not want. 50-50, he said. "Maybe better. Voss has money and a lawyer. But this affidavit calls the whole survey finding into question, and if we can get Beaumont to file the appeal quickly enough, the territorial office will have to review it before they process the eviction order." He paused. "It is a fair fight." "That is more than most people in your position can say." Rosa thought about that. A fair fight. She would take it. They arrived back at Dusk Creek in the blue hour between late afternoon and evening, and Elias went with her to find Attorney Beaumont, who was indeed sober, it being a Tuesday, and Beaumont apparently observed a personal moratorium on drinking before Wednesday afternoons. He was a heavy-set man with a thick gray beard and small, sharp eyes that lit up when Rosa spread the survey papers and the affidavit on his desk and explained the situation. "Voss," Beaumont said, and made the name sound like something he was wiping off his boot. "He pulled this same thing with the Hadley family 2 years ago. That time there was no affidavit. This time, he picked up the document and read it slowly. This time we have Mr. Alcott's testimony, which in 20 years of frontier law I have found to be among the most reliable in the territory." He set it down. "Mrs. Ralston, I will file this appeal tomorrow morning by the earliest post. I will also send a letter to the Voss legal team informing them that we are challenging the survey findings and that any attempt to enforce the eviction order prior to the territorial office's review will be contested vigorously." Rosa looked at him steadily. "What are your fees?" Beaumont named a figure that made her blink. It was not unreasonable for the work involved, but it was money she did not have. "I can pay half now," she said, which was a lie by about a third, but she was prepared to manage, "and the rest once the wheat is harvested." Beaumont looked at her for a moment and then looked at Elias and then looked back at Rosa. "Half when the appeal is accepted for review," he said. "The rest at harvest. I have done this work on contingency before and I will do it again." He held out his hand. "We have a deal, Mrs. Ralston." Outside in the evening air of Dust Creek's Main Street, with the lamps beginning to light in the windows and the sound of the saloon's piano starting up across the way, Rosa stood very still for a moment and then turned to Elias and said, with considerably more emotion in her voice than she had intended, "Thank you." He looked at her with that careful expression she was beginning to know. "We have not won anything yet." "I know," she said. "But yesterday morning I had nothing. Tonight I have a chance." "That is because of you." She paused. "You sat down on those steps and asked me to tell you everything. You did not have to do that." "No," he agreed, "but I am glad I did." They stood in the lamplight of Dust Creek's Main Street and looked at each other. And the moment was one of those moments that carries more weight than the actual number of seconds it occupies. The kind of moment that people remember much later as the point where something shifted between them, though neither of them said so out loud. And they went their separate ways into the Texas evening with the prairie wind warm against their faces, and the stars coming up over the flat horizon like the lights of some impossibly distant city. In the days that followed, Elias came by the homestead regularly. Not every day, because he had his work at the Caldwell Ranch, and he was not a man who shirked his responsibilities, but often enough that Rosa began to expect him, and then began to look forward to expecting him, which was different. He helped her with things that needed 2 pairs of hands, repairing the corral fence that had been listing badly since a spring storm, checking on Biscuit's foot, and determining that the problem was a stone bruise that would heal with rest, and not the more serious tendon issue Rosa had feared, mending the roof of the cabin's linta that had developed a gap she had been managing with a pot to catch the drips. He did these things in the uncomplicated way of a man who saw what needed doing and did it, without requiring gratitude or acknowledgement beyond what was genuine, and Rosa gave him genuine gratitude and meals and conversation, and the arrangement had an ease to it that she thought might be, in its own understated way, one of the more pleasant arrangements she had known. She was honest with herself about what was growing in her. She was not a woman who played games with herself about her own feelings, which was one of the practical gifts of the year of hardship she had just come through. She knew that she was drawn to Elias Keller with a pull that had started as gratitude and warmth, and had become something considerably more specific. She knew she noticed when he smiled, which was not as often as it should have been but which was worth the wait. She knew she liked the sound of his voice carrying across the yard when he was talking to Copper, and she liked the way he disagreed with her on things without being disagreeable, and she liked that he had read the books she had read and had opinions about them, and she liked his hands, which was perhaps too specific a thing to admit even to herself, but there it was. She did not say any of this. She had been a widow for less than a year, and she was in the middle of a land dispute that threatened to take everything she had, and she was a sensible woman. She kept herself busy. Beaumont filed the appeal on a Thursday. The territorial office acknowledged receipt a week later, which Beaumont said was unusually fast and probably meant they were taking it seriously, which could be either good or bad, as he explained with the particular pleasure that lawyers seem to take in the ambiguity of processes. Voss's legal team, as promised, received a letter informing them that the eviction order would be contested, and 3 days after that letter was sent, Elias came to Rosa's homestead in the late afternoon with a look on his face that she could not quite parse. "What is it?" she said, standing up from where she had been weeding between the kitchen garden rows. "Voss sent a man out to talk to me today," Elias said. He had dismounted and was standing at Copper's head with his hand on the bridle. "At the Caldwell Ranch. I know why, because I have been spending time out here and people in Dust Creek talk. What did his man say?" "That Voss wants to offer you a settlement. He will let you harvest your wheat crop and keep the proceeds, and he will give you 60 days to vacate instead of 17 if you drop the appeal." Rosa straightened up and pushed her hat back on her head and looked at Elias with eyes that had gone very steady and very clear. He would not offer a settlement if he was confident in his position. "No," Elias said, "he would not." "Then the answer is no." Elias looked at her with an expression that might have been admiration and might have been something more, and said, "I will let them know." The following week brought 3 things in quick succession. First, Beaumont received word from Austin that the territorial office had agreed to suspend the eviction order pending review of the new survey evidence, which meant Rosa could not be forced off her land while the appeal was being decided. Second, Biscuit's foot healed sufficiently that he could be ridden again, slowly, which meant Rosa had her horse back. Third, Elias Keller, helping Rosa repair a section of the pasture fence on a hot afternoon in early June, said something that was not at all about fence repair, and changed the nature of things between them. They had been working in companionable silence for some time, and the silence had the quality that good silence between 2 people can have, which is that it is not actually silence, but a form of conversation conducted without words. The sun was bearing down and the grasshoppers were loud in the grass, and Rosa's hair had escaped from under her hat in a way she had stopped worrying about sometime around the 2nd hour of fence repair, and she was holding a post steady while Elias drove it with the mallet, and he paused between strikes and said, not looking at her, "I want you to know that when I sat down on those steps, it was not because I felt sorry for you." Rosa thought about that for a moment. "What was it because of?" "Because you had the most honest face I had ever seen on a person," he said, and he looked at her then directly, without any of the careful distance that he usually maintained. "Like every feeling you were having was right there, and you were not pretending otherwise. I have spent a lot of years around people who show you one face and mean something else entirely. I saw you and I thought, here is someone real." Rosa held the fence post and looked at him and felt the candle flame, which had been burning steadily for these past weeks, become something more like a fire. "That is an unusual reason to sit down next to a crying stranger," she said. "I am an unusual man," he said, and then the corner of his mouth did that thing where it almost smiled before the smile actually happened, and Rosa thought, very clearly and without any ambiguity, that she was thoroughly lost and was not particularly sorry about it. She did not say this. She said, "Hold the post while I check the line," and they went back to the fence, but something had settled between them like the right note of a melody that had been almost but not quite in tune, and they both knew it, and they were both careful with it, the way you are careful with something that matters. July came in hot and relentless the way Texas July always does, and the wheat stood in Rosa's field in great golden swells that moved in the wind like something alive, something breathing, and she walked the rows in the evenings and felt the heads and calculated and thought, "It is going to be a good harvest. It is going to be enough." The appeal was still pending. Beaumont said these things took time, which was technically true and practically maddening. Rosa had heard nothing more from Voss directly, though she knew through the particular information network of a small frontier town that he was not pleased with the way things were going. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted through the kind of legal maneuvering that worked when the other side had no resources. She had found resources, and she had found them in the form of an affidavit from a meticulous surveyor and an attorney who had a personal distaste for Voss's methods, and the territorial office, to its occasional credit, was apparently taking both seriously. It was on a Saturday evening in mid-July, with the sun going down in a wash of red and orange that painted everything in the colors of autumn, though it was still high summer, that Elias arrived at the homestead not to work but clearly to talk. He had washed up and was not in his work clothes, which Rosa noticed, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands in a way that was very different from the casual, comfortable man who had sat down beside her on the steps of the land office. "I would like to take you to supper," he said. "In town, at Edna's diner, if you would be willing." Rosa looked at him. He looked back at her with the directness she had come to rely on, but underneath it was something that she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for weeks, a kind of nervous hope that was trying very hard to be dignified about itself. "I would be willing," she said. Edna Marsh, when they came in, said nothing at all, but she gave them the best table, the one by the window that caught the evening breeze, and she brought the coffee without being asked, and also brought a slice of her dried apple pie that she had not put on the menu but produced from somewhere with the air of a woman who had been waiting for this particular occasion. They talked through supper, and through the pie, and through 2 more cups of coffee, and they talked the way people talk when they are finally saying things they have been thinking for a long time, and finding that the saying of them is easier than expected and better than expected and opens doors into more things to say. Elias told her that he had been working toward his own land claim for 3 years and had the money nearly saved, enough for a good filing in a location he had been considering north of town, good grass and a reliable spring. Rosa told him that what she wanted most in the world was to stay on her homestead, to see the wheat harvested and the kitchen garden through its full season, and to know, come next spring, that the ground under her feet was still hers. "I want to keep building something," she said. "Thomas and I started something here, and it was good, and then it was just mine, and I do not want to lose it, but more than that, I do not want to just survive it. I want to build it into something real." Elias was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. Then he said, "Rosa," just her name, nothing before it and nothing after, but the way he said it made it into something much more than a name. She met his eyes. "I think you know that what I feel for you has gone considerably past being a concerned neighbor," he said, with the careful precision of a man who is choosing his words very deliberately because they matter. "I think you have known it for a while, and I think, if I am reading things correctly, that it may not be entirely without return." Rosa felt something in her chest that was not quite pain and not quite joy, but was possibly both at once, the particular sensation of a wall you have been very carefully maintaining coming down. "You are reading things correctly," she said. The smile that came was not the restrained, almost smile she had been watching for weeks. It was a real smile, unguarded and warm, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a long time. "I do not want to rush anything," he said, and the seriousness came back into his face because he meant it. "You have been through an enormous amount and you are still in the middle of it. I am not going anywhere and I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give, but I did not want to go on not saying it." "I am glad you said it," Rosa told him. They walked back down the main street of Dust Creek in the warm summer dark, close enough that their hands bumped, and then his hand found hers and held it, and they walked like that under the stars all the way to where Copper and Biscuit were hitched, and it was one of those quietly significant moments that does not announce itself as significant, but that you know, even as it is happening, that you will remember for the rest of your life. 3 days later, the territorial office in Austin sent its decision. Beaumont brought the letter personally, riding out to the homestead in the late morning with his gray beard somewhat more organized than usual, and his eyes bright with the expression of a man who has good news and is enjoying the having of it. Rosa was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, and she wiped her hands on her apron and stood in the yard, and looked at the envelope he was holding out with a stillness that was not calm so much as the suspension of breath. "Read it," she said. The appeal of Rosa Ralston, widow, against the competing land claim filed by Harlan Voss in the matter of Survey Section 14, Caldwell Creek Township, Dust Creek, Texas, Beaumont read, with the gravity of a man who had practiced law for 20 years and still appreciated a good moment of drama when it presented itself, has been reviewed and sustained. The survey evidence presented, including the certified affidavit of licensed surveyor J.P. Alcott, demonstrates with sufficient clarity that the error cited in the original filing was the result of post-survey boundary marker displacement, and does not reflect an error in the original filing itself. The competing claim of Harlan Voss is hereby dismissed. The original homestead filing of Thomas Edwin Ralston, now held by Rosa Marilyn Ralston, is confirmed valid and binding. Beaumont lowered the letter. Rosa stood in her yard with the summer wind moving through the wheat behind her and the sun on her face, and said nothing for a moment that stretched and stretched. And then she pressed both hands against her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears that were nothing at all like the tears she had shed on the steps of the land office, because those had been tears of despair, and these were the other kind. She got through 2 sentences of thanking Beaumont before she gave up on coherence entirely, and simply shook his hand very hard, and he was gracious about it, and helped himself to water at her well, and left her with the letter and the legal confirmation and the whole glorious, unambiguous fact of her land being hers. She rode to the Caldwell Ranch. She did not usually ride to the Caldwell Ranch. It was not her place to, and she was very aware of the ways that frontier propriety, while it had its absurdities, also had its practical purposes. But she rode Biscuit there, at a pace that his recently healed foot could manage comfortably, which was faster than it had any right to be given that she was supposed to be taking it slow, and she arrived in the ranch yard and swung off, and one of the cowhands on the porch pointed at the barn, and she went to the barn and found Elias there working on a piece of harness with his head bent and his sleeves rolled up. He looked up and saw her face and was on his feet immediately. The harness dropped. "What happened?" "We won," she said. The way his face changed from alert concern to something open and warm and entirely unguarded was something she kept like a photograph in her memory. He came across the barn and she met him halfway, and he took her hands in his and held them, and the look on his face was so unaffectedly glad. Glad for her. Glad in the genuine way that a person is glad for something that matters to them as much as it matters to the one it has happened to. That Rosa thought with absolute clarity. This is the man, this is the one, and kissed him, which was entirely her doing and entirely correct. It was a brief kiss, there in the barn in the June afternoon light, because Elias pulled back and looked at her with wide eyes that had something startled and delighted in them, and said, "Mrs. Ralston," in a voice that was thoroughly unsteady. "Rosa," she corrected. "It is Rosa. It has been Rosa this whole time." "Rosa," he said, and said it the same way he had said it at Edna's diner, as though it were a complete sentence, and then kissed her back, which was considerably less brief. Harvest came in August, and it was everything Rosa had hoped it would be. Elias took 3 days of his own time, something that required a negotiation with the Caldwell Outfits foreman, that Rosa later learned had involved Elias trading 2 Sundays of extra work in exchange, to help her bring the wheat in. He brought with him 2 of his fellow hands from the Caldwell Ranch, men named Pete Morales and Sam Dutchamp, who came willingly enough when Elias explained the situation, and who proved to be excellent company, Pete being a man of enormous and largely inappropriate humor, and Sam being the kind of quiet, efficient worker who makes everything go faster simply by being present. Mrs. Lindqvist came from 3 miles west with her 2 grown sons, and Beaumont came, to everyone's surprise, and turned out to be a respectable hand with a scythe for a man of his profession. They brought in 30 acres of wheat in 2.5 days. Rosa stood at the edge of the field on the evening of the second day, and watched the last of it come in with the golden light going long and soft across everything, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of completed work, of something you have struggled for coming to its right conclusion. Voss did not reappear. He had, Beaumont explained, attempted one more legal avenue following the decision from Austin, which had been dismissed with considerably less ceremony than his original claim had been. He was a man of resources, but not of unlimited resources, and the cost of pursuing a claim that had now been twice rejected by proper legal process was apparently more than even his stubbornness could justify. He went back to managing his existing range, and that was the end of it, though Rosa was aware for a long time afterward that he was not a man given to grace in defeat, and she was careful about her fences and her boundaries, and kept good records of everything. In September, with the harvest sold and the seed debt paid, and a modest but real surplus in the tin box she kept under the floorboard beneath her bed, Rosa and Elias sat on the rocky outcrop in the north corner of her land, the one she had mentioned the first day they had talked, and watched the sun go down and talked about the future. It was Elias who said it first, which surprised Rosa because she had been expecting to have to say it herself. He said it plainly and without elaborate preamble, because he was not a man given to elaborate preamble. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said, "if you are willing." Rosa looked at the sunset and then looked at him. "What about your own land claim?" "I had a conversation with Alcott," he said. "He surveyed a parcel 3 miles north of yours that would adjoin it if we were to expand your homestead's northern boundary. Between your saving and mine and 2 proper filings, we could work both parcels as one operation." He paused. "I am not asking because it makes practical sense. It makes practical sense, and that is a fortunate coincidence. I am asking because I cannot imagine building what I want to build with anyone else, and the thought of your land being yours and my land being mine, when we could have all of it be ours, seems like a kind of poverty I am not interested in." Rosa was quiet for long enough that the last edge of the sun dipped below the flat horizon and the sky turned violet. "Yes," she said, "the answer is yes." They were married in October at the Methodist Church in Dust Creek, on a day when the sky was the perfect deep blue of early fall and the air had the first real sharpness of the coming cool. Edna Marsh baked the wedding cake. Beaumont acted as a witness. Mrs. Lindqvist brought her 2 sons, and a casserole that could have fed twice as many people as were present. Pete Morales and Sam Duchamp came from the Caldwell Ranch, and Pete cried, which he denied firmly afterward, and continued to deny for the rest of his acquaintance with both of them. Elias' sister Clara came from San Antonio with her husband, a mild schoolteacher named Arthur, who was immediately and completely charmed by Rosa, and Clara embraced Rosa in the churchyard before the ceremony and said, "I have been waiting for someone to do this to him for years," which was not entirely a clear statement but had an obvious positive meaning. Rosa wore a dress the color of cream that Mrs. Lindqvist had helped her alter, because it was not a new dress. It had been her mother's good dress, sent from Ohio in a parcel that had arrived coincidentally the previous month, and it fit Rosa as though it had been made for her. She carried fall wildflowers, the last of the season, yellow and rust and deep purple, and when she walked down the aisle of the small white church and saw Elias standing at the front in his good jacket with his dark hair combed into an approximation of neatness, and his eyes on her face with an expression that was everything at once, she felt that the prairie and the sky and the hard year and the wheat and the land office steps and the coffee at Edna's diner, and all of it had been leading here with the inevitability of water finding its way to the lowest point, the place where it was supposed to be. The preacher, a young man named Alderman who took his work seriously, read from the book of Ruth, which Rosa had requested, and when he came to the part about whither thou goest I will go, she felt Elias' hand tighten on hers, and she turned to look at him, and his eyes were very bright in a way that he was managing with great dignity. They said the words. They meant the words. That evening, after the guests had gone and Clara and Arthur had taken themselves to the town's small hotel, Rosa and Elias sat on the porch of the homestead cabin in the October cool and looked at the sky full of stars and the dark outlines of the wheat fields that were resting now, plowed under and waiting for spring planting, and the larger darkness of the northern parcel that Elias had now filed on, which was theirs. Which was a word that Rosa turned over in her mind with the same hand she had turned the wedding ring on her finger. "Tell me what you are thinking," Elias said. She smiled and leaned into him, his arm coming around her automatically. "That this is exactly where I am supposed to be," she said. "On a cold porch in October," he said. "Yes," she said, "exactly on this cold porch in October." He pressed his lips to her hair. That was the right answer. The following spring they planted both parcels. The homestead's original 30 acres went into wheat again, but Elias had surveyed the soil composition of the new northern parcel carefully, a process that involved a lot of him crouching in fields and examining dirt in a way that Rosa found privately endearing, and determined that the western portion of it was better suited to corn, and that the eastern section, which was lower lying and held moisture well, could take kitchen garden expansion and an orchard. If they planted young trees this spring and were patient. They planted young apple and peach trees in a row along the eastern boundary, and Rosa stood back and looked at them and thought about the fruit they would bear in years to come, about the children who might eat that fruit, and felt the fullness of what it meant to be building something not just for now but for the future. In June of that year, Rosa realized she was expecting a child. She told Elias on a Wednesday evening after supper, sitting at the same table where she had spread Thomas's survey maps the first night Elias had stayed for supper. Though the table had grown, they had built a proper one out of good pine in the winter, and she told him the way she did most things, directly and without ceremony. He sat very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression so nakedly moved that she felt her own eyes fill. "Are you well?" he asked, and the question, asking first not about his own feelings but about her, was so precisely him that she laughed through the tears. "I am very well," she said. "I am better than well." He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in his hands and held her for a moment just looking at her, and then said, quietly, "Thank you," which was an unusual thing to say and was the most right thing imaginable. In February of 1887, Rosa Keller gave birth to a son in the bedroom of the expanded homestead cabin, with the help of Dust Creek's doctor, a tired but competent man named Graves, and Mrs. Lindquist, who took charge of matters in the way that experienced women take charge of matters and was invaluable. Elias spent the long hours in the front room of the cabin being as calm as he could manage, which was not very calm, though he kept the fire well built and the water hot, and answered promptly every time anyone needed anything from him. The baby came in the small hours of a February morning when the stars were very bright and the air was very cold and very clear, and the first sound he made was a sound of thorough personal objection to his circumstances, which made Dr. Graves laugh and Mrs. Lindquist nod with satisfaction and Rosa, exhausted and radiant, say, "Good. He knows his mind." They named him Joseph Thomas Keller. Joseph for Elias' father, Thomas for Rosa's first husband, who had started this story with the homestead filing that had eventually brought her to those steps where everything had changed. It was a name that held both what had been and what was, and Elias agreed to it without a moment's hesitation, because he was the kind of man who understood that love is not diminished by being layered, and that honoring the past does not compete with living in the present. Joseph Thomas Keller was a strong baby who grew into a strong boy, a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and from the moment he was old enough to be outside in them, a thorough love of the fields that surrounded the homestead. He learned to walk between the wheat rows, holding Rosa's hand with one fist and Elias with the other, his small feet unsteady on the dirt and his dark eyes, which were exactly his father's eyes, taking in the whole vast world with the particular unflappable curiosity of a child who has been loved well enough to find everything interesting rather than threatening. Elias formalized his position with the homestead operation in the spring of 1887, taking his leave of the Caldwell outfit with considerable mutual respect and a handshake from the foreman that had real warmth in it. He was a rancher now, or rather they were, because from the beginning it was always theirs, and the question of whose name was on which paper was secondary to the fact that they made every decision together, which was not always easy because Rosa had strong opinions and Elias had considered opinions, and these did not always align, and the discussions that resulted were sometimes heated, and always honest and generally arrived at a better place than either had started. They added cattle the second year. Not many, a small herd of 20 to begin, bought from a rancher 2 counties over who was downsizing, good stock, mixed longhorn and shorthorn that were hardy enough for the Texas conditions. Pete Morales left the Caldwell outfit the same year and came to work for them, his humor undiminished and his skills considerable, and Sam Dutchamp joined them the following spring. The operation grew by the careful increments of people who are building something they intend to last rather than something they intend to impress, and Dusk Creek saw the Keller homestead change from a widow's struggling claim to a genuine and growing ranch with a steadiness that earned its reputation the slow right way. The apple and peach trees bore their first real fruit in the autumn of 1889. It was not a tremendous harvest, young trees being what they are, but it was enough for preserves and cobblers and a bushel that Rosa sent to Edna Marsh's diner with a note that said only, "From the Keller orchard with thanks." And Edna, who never displayed sentiment publicly, put the note in the till and made a peach pie that she sold out of in 2 hours and told everyone who asked about it exactly where the fruit had come from. That same autumn, Rosa found herself expecting again. She told Elias the same way she had told him the first time, directly and at the dinner table, and his response was the same, the stillness, the full attention, the question about her well-being before anything else, and she loved him for it with a fullness that 8 years of frontier life and 4 years of marriage had only deepened and made more real. Their second child was a daughter, born in the spring of 1890 in the same bedroom, with the same Dr. Graves in attendance, who was now more tired but no less competent, and the same Mrs. Lindqvist, who at this point regarded her participation in these births as a personal tradition she had no intention of interrupting. They named her Clara Me Keller, Clara for Elias' sister, who received this news in San Antonio and responded with a letter that ran to 4 pages and was read aloud in its entirety at the dinner table, and was the occasion for more than one outburst of laughter. Joseph, who was 3 years old when his sister arrived, greeted her with the solemn seriousness of a boy who had been prepared for this event and had been given to understand that it was important. He stood beside the bed and looked at the small and not particularly impressive person in Rosa's arms with the expression of a man taking inventory. "Is she going to stay?" he asked. "She is going to stay," Rosa confirmed. He considered this. "Good," he said, and that was the end of his deliberation on the matter, and from that point forward he was a good and patient older brother with the kind of steady protectiveness that he had gotten from watching his father. Dusk Creek grew around them as the years passed. The railroad came through in 1891, which changed the economics of the whole county and made the cattle operation more viable because of easier access to markets. New families arrived, some of them homesteaders like Rosa had been, and Rosa was known by this time as someone who would help them navigate the process, who knew the land office and the attorneys and the surveyors, and who could explain with the authority of hard experience exactly what to check in a survey filing and why. She did this without being asked, and without anything expected in return, because she remembered the particular terror of those steps, the way the world had shrunk to the papers in Prewitt's hands and the impossibility of what he had just told her, and she did not want other people to navigate that alone if she could help it. Elias had a habit, on evenings when the work was done and the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet, of sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and looking out over the land. Sometimes Rosa sat with him and they talked, and sometimes she came and sat beside him in the comfortable silence that had become between them one of their languages, as fluent and intimate as the spoken one. She would lean against his shoulder and he would wrap an arm around her and they would look at the same view, the wheat fields and the pastures and the dark line of the orchard and the vast sky above all of it. And there was in these evenings a completeness that Rosa thought was the true measure of what they had built, not the acreage or the cattle count or the harvest figures, but this, the two of them in the quiet, looking at what they had made together and it being enough. More than enough. It being exactly right. In the summer of 1892, with Joseph 5 years old and Clara me too, and the ranch in its best year yet with the wheat prices strong and the cattle herd grown to 60, and the orchard producing genuinely well, Beaumont came to dinner. He had retired from active practice the previous year, turning his office over to a younger attorney, and he had more time now for things like accepting dinner invitations from former clients, which he did with the comfortable authority of a man who intends to enjoy his retirement properly. He sat at the long pine table that Rosa and Elias had built in the first winter of their marriage, and ate the roasted chicken and the corn and the fresh bread that was one of Rosa's particular accomplishments. And he told them that the Voss Ranch had been sold the previous month to an Eastern land company that intended to break it up into smaller holdings, and that Harlan Voss himself had retired to San Antonio to live with his daughter. "Good riddance to bad rubbish," Pete Morales said from his end of the table, because Pete also ate dinner with them, which had been the arrangement since he had come to work there and was not something anyone saw any reason to change, and Rosa said, "Pete," in a mild tone of reprimand, and Pete said, "My apologies, I meant good riddance to bad rubbish, ma'am." And Clara me laughed at this without understanding why, which made everyone else laugh as well. After dinner, Beaumont sat on the porch with Elias and had a glass of bourbon, and they talked for a while about the county, and the changes coming with the railroad, and the question of whether the territorial government was going to handle the ongoing land rights issues of the region with any more competence than it had historically managed, which was not a short conversation. Rosa came out after she had put the children down and sat in the third chair and listened for a while, and then Beaumont looked at her and said, with the directness that she had always respected in him, "You have done well, Mrs. Keller. You have done very well indeed." Rosa looked out at the dark fields and the orchard silhouettes and the stars above the flat horizon and felt the warmth of Elias' hand finding hers in the dark between their chairs, and thought about the woman who had sat on those steps and wept. "We have done well," she said. "We have done it together." Beaumont raised his glass and said nothing, which was, coming from a lawyer, the highest possible compliment. The years move the way years do when the life you are living is full and honest, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular rhythm of seasons and work and love that feels both long and brief when you look back at it. Joseph grew into a boy of real character, serious and curious and fundamentally kind, who could ride a horse competently at 6 and read well above his years, and who had, Rosa noted with a private satisfaction that she mentioned to Elias often, his father's way of listening to people as though what they were saying genuinely mattered. Clara me was different, louder and more immediately exuberant, a girl who could be found at any given moment either up a tree or in the middle of some elaborate enterprise involving the barn cats and several pieces of equipment she had appropriated from the shed. and who charmed everyone she encountered with a directness that was either her mother's or her own, or some combination that had its own particular quality. They had a third child in 1894, another son born in the spring, healthy and loud about it. They named him William Alcott Keller, William because Elias had always liked the name, and because Elias' grandfather had been a William, and Alcott because they felt they owed the old surveyor something. And when Rosa wrote to Alcott in Junction City to tell him, so he sent back a letter that was one of the more dignified expressions of being genuinely moved that Rosa had ever read, coming from a man who was professionally accustomed to the most precise possible language. Little William, who was quickly called Will in the way that small children rename themselves by refusing the full version, was a sunny-natured child who appeared to have been born in a good mood and saw no reason to leave it. He followed Joseph with the loyalty of a younger brother who has found his model, and followed Clara me with the helpless admiration of a boy who recognizes genius when it causes chaos around him, and followed Rosa and Elias with the complete and guileless love of a child who has been well loved and considers this the natural order of things. On the last evening of the summer of 1895, Rosa and Elias rode out together to the northern parcel, the land that Elias had filed on in the year before their marriage, which was now fully integrated into the Keller operation, but which still felt to them both like the land that had completed the story, the piece that had made the whole thing possible. They left the children in Pete's entirely capable care, because Pete Morales had proved over the years to be a man of unexpected and wide-ranging competence, and they rode out in the long evening light with the shadows of the horses long before them on the grass. They stopped at the high point of the northern parcel, the slight rise that gave a view of both parcels and the orchard and the cabin and the barn and the whole operation spread out in the amber light of the going-down sun. Rosa sat on her horse and looked at it, all of it. The wheat fields, already plowed under and waiting for fall planting, the pastures with the cattle moving slowly in them, the orchard trees, heavy with the last of the summer's fruit. The cabin, expanded now to 4 rooms, with a proper porch that Elias had built the previous winter and smoke coming from the chimney where Pete had the supper fire going. "Do you remember," she said, "sitting on those steps?" "I remember," Elias said. He was sitting on Copper, who was 12 now and gray around the muzzle but still steady. "You had on a gray dress and your hair was coming loose from under your hat, and you were the most unhappy person I had ever seen and also the most determined." Rosa laughed. "I was a mess." "You were not a mess," he said. "You were a person who had had something terrible happen and was not going to let it be the end of the story." She turned to look at him. 10 years she had known him and 9 years of marriage, and she still looked at his face and felt the same thing she had felt in the barn at the Caldwell Ranch when he had looked up and seen her with the news that they had won. That openness, that warmth, that rightness. "You sat down," she said. "You sat down next to a crying stranger and you said, 'Tell me everything.' You know what I think that was?" "What do you think it was?" "I think it was the bravest thing," she said. "Not in the way that shooting things is brave. In the way that being present for someone else's pain is brave. In the way that caring is brave." Elias looked at her with everything he was in his face, the way he had learned to look at her over 10 years of knowing that she wanted honesty and could be trusted with it. "I sat down because you were real," he said. "And everything I found out after was more real still. And this," he looked out at the land, all of it, everything they had made, "is the most real thing I have ever been part of." Rosa reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, and they sat like that in the last of the evening light, with the Texas wind moving through the grass around them, and the stars beginning to come up one by one overhead, and the smoke from their chimney rising straight and clean into the cooling air, and the horses stood patient and still, and the fields waited for morning and planting and harvest. And below the rise their children were probably causing some variety of well-intentioned chaos for Pete Morales, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. She thought, briefly and clearly, of the woman she had been on those steps. Exhausted and frightened and alone in a way that the presence of other people in the world does not preclude. She thought of what she had known then and what she had not known, of the land that had felt lost and the future that had felt like something that was happening to other people. She thought of how the step had been worn smooth in the middle from years of feet passing over it, and how the wood of it had been warm from the morning sun, and how a man she had never seen before in her life had sat down beside her and offered her his attention as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Tell me everything," he had said. She had. She had told him everything, and the telling had been the beginning of all of it, the beginning of the fight for the land and the beginning of the appeal and the beginning of two people learning each other and the beginning of this, of all of this. "Come on," she said. "Supper will be ready." They turned the horses and rode back down the slope toward the lights of the cabin, and the wind came up warm from the south and moved through the grass with a sound like breathing, and the stars came up steady and bright above the flat Texas horizon. And Rosa Keller rode home through the evening with her husband beside her and her children waiting and her land solid and whole beneath her. And she thought that she would remember this evening for the rest of her life. And then she thought, no, I will not just remember it. I will live it again tomorrow and the day after that, because this is not a moment that ends. This is what it is to have found where you belong. The last of the sun sank below the horizon, and the sky turned from orange to purple to the first dark blue of night, and in the cabin below them the lamp went on in the window, warm and steady, the way a lamp goes on when the people inside know that someone they love is coming home. And Rosa saw it and smiled, and Elias saw her smile and felt, as he had felt on 100 evenings before this one, and as he would feel on 100 evenings after, that he was the luckiest man to have ever sat down on the steps of a land office on a bright May morning in Dust Creek, Texas. He had sat down and asked a woman to tell him everything. She had, and the everything had turned out to be magnificent.